Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's SYCL webinar hosted by Khronos. I am Dr. Tom Deakin from the University of Bristol, and I'm looking forward to hosting this webinar this afternoon. I've just got a few short things to say, but I'd like to hand over as quickly as possible to our great speakers this afternoon. So here are the pictures of everybody that you'll hear from today. That's me in the top left there. And we'll start off by a short update about SYCL itself, the SYCL standard, and what's coming next from Michael. He'll take over from me just in a moment or two. Then we have our keynote presentation from Professor Garth Wells from the University of Cambridge in the UK. Really looking forward to hearing that presentation. And then following that, we've got 5 more talks. Each of those talks is going to be given by someone right at the heart of implementing SYCL. And obviously those SYCL implementations are things we as users use all the time when building and running our SYCL applications. So I'm really looking forward to hearing updates from each of those 5 speakers about their SYCL implementations, a really important part of the ecosystem. So it's good to hear from one of those. For those of you joining, here's just a few little bits of information about how to participate in the webinar today. Please do interact. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So during the presentations, please submit any questions you have to the speakers using the Q&A button in Zoom. It's the one that looks a bit like 2 speech bubbles. The chat is just 1 speech bubble, and use that if you need some help, and there'll be some people to help you out. But it's the Q&A with the 2 speech bubbles if you'd like to ask one of our speakers a question, and I'll put it to them at the end of their talk. Everything else, use the general chats if you'd like. We are recording this webinar and we'll make it available along with the slides from all the presenters on the Khronos Group website following the end of the webinar. At the end, there'll also be a short survey to fill out. So when the webinar is over, if you could please fill out that survey, that would be very much appreciated. So with that, we'll hand over to our first speaker. So I'd like to introduce Michael Wong. Michael is the chair of the SYCL working group, and so is in charge of making sure that we're all getting the SYCL standard ready for everybody. So Michael, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to check to make sure that my screen share is working. Maybe that's better. All right. Welcome, everybody. This is so exciting to see so many great speakers lined up here. My name is Michael Wong, and I'm a distinguished engineer with CodePlay and the SYCL working group chair. So for today's quick talk, I'm going to walk you through a few quick things about SYCL. I'm going to skip through most of these other slides. First thing first, just to introduce SYCL, I'm sure a lot of you guys know what it is, but it is what we call a single source C++ parallel programming framework that sits between all your great C++ code that uses modern C++. They might be using some template libraries. They might be using OneMKL, OneDNN, DPC, BLAST, EigenDNN, or even Parallel STL, or some machine learning framework. And from there, it generates code with possible kernel fusion that can give better performance on complex applications and libraries than hand coding to either OpenCL or some backend. Okay, so SYCL is ideal for accelerating larger C++ based engines and applications for performance portability. And in case you're still wondering why we need something like SYCL, it's because ISO C++, the compilers, the list of compilers on the right that you see, the CPU compilers on the right, still doesn't really recognize offloads to device targets like GPUs, FPGAs, tensor processors, or digital signal processors. So you need to augment the ISO C++ standard for that. So let me talk about something I'm really passionate about as chair of the SYCL working group, SYCL 2020. It's here and it's ready for developers to use. It's been released after 3 years of intense work with significant adoption in embedded desktop and HPC markets. There's improved programmability, there's smaller code size, there's faster performance, and it's based on C++ 17. It's backwards compatible with SYCL 121. It really, in my opinion, simplifies porting of standard C++ applications to SYCL and along with our long-term goal of being closely aligned and integrating with ISO C++, it also supports multiple backends and accelerations with API that is independent. In my opinion, SYCL 2020, you have to remember a couple of things. It increases expressiveness and simplicity for modern C++ heterogeneous programming. Right. So I want to point out the incredible SYCL industry momentum in recent years. And most recently, you might have seen the Next platform asking, can SYCL slice into supercomputing? And that's based on the announcement of the collaboration with NERSC, Argonne Leadership Computing Facility on SYCL on the Perlmutter supercomputer. Before that is SYCL and DPC++ on Aurora. DPC++ is the Intel OneAPI implementation of SYCL you see on the top right. There's going to be talks about that later on. There is the NSI Tech's Kyoto microcomputer joint work using SYCL on the RISC-V vector system. And then there's triSYCL for Xilinx FPGA work from University of West Scotland. You're going to hear talks about that. There's the Renaissance Codeplay collaboration using SYCL and OpenCL on their RCAR ADAS solution. And then there's also hipSYCL implementation for AMD ROCm and CUDA GPUs. And definitely there's going to be a talk about that. So there's the TensorFlow native support on PowerVR using optimized SYCL libraries. So what is SYCL 2020? It's the newest release of the SYCL specification that's ratified by the working group. And it represents a major step forward, featuring over 40 new additions and improvements, including unified shared memory, parallel reductions, workgroup and subgroup algorithms, improvements to atomic operations. C++ 17 supports of class template argument deductions and deduction guides, simplification of accessors, and expanded interoperability with multiple different backends. You see, we used to just be based on the OpenCL backend, but with SYCL 2020, we now have opened it up to officially support many different kinds of backend. You already see supports for like Vulkan or direct support for NVIDIA PTX or something like that. Okay. All right. So this slide is about parallel industry initiatives. In other words, we actually follow what other industry standards are going with their release schedule, where we basically release SYCL 2020 based on C++ 17. So that means that it enables all the exciting C++ features like CTAD and deduction guides. So you're going to see that we released SYCL 121 here in 2017, and previous to that, 1.2 in 2015. And if you're going to predict that this seems to me that we are releasing things every 1.5 to 3 years, you'll be right. This is matching to the ISO C++ schedule. We're basically adapted to a bus train schedule. Next slide after that is going to talk about the various SYCL implementations in development. You see across the top, across the left, there's the Intel DPC++, the Codeplay ComputeCPP, the Xilinx triSYCL, University Heidelberg's hipSYCL, and recently 2 new additions from neoSYCL from Japan's Tohoku University on the NEC Aurora, and the Huawei Baisheng SYCL C++ compiler on their Kunpeng CPU and Ascend GPU architecture. So there's multiple backends that's been in development. And this is clearly supporting our SYCL 2020 initiative for different kinds of backends. All right, so this slide is probably the big ecosystem slide, giving you information about the various, just bits and bytes I'm pulled out from all the knowledge we have about the many different projects that are supporting SYCL. Across the top left, you already see the implementations. And then in the middle, you'll see the research papers. And I'm just calling out a few, specifically Celerity and the ECP, the Exascale Computing Project. There's also Cocos and Raja, C++ that is being rebased to using SYCL. And then there's TaskFlow from Utah. There is the Atlas experiment, as well as GROMACS, which is a molecular dynamics package mainly designed for simulations of proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids from Eric Lindahl from Stockholm University, and that's also a CPU benchmark that is now being accelerated for SYCL. You see the Alpaca library, that's a header-only C++ 14 abstraction library. Okay, now across the right, you're going to see all the various recent support for benchmarks and books. Specifically, I want to call your attention to the Data Parallel C++ book from our Intel friends, led by James Rinder. And in fact, I think James is actually on, James Broadman is on to talk about some of this stuff. It's a free download. And across the far right, you'll see the support for linear algebra, machine learning parallel, acceleration frameworks. And of course, in the bottom, you'll see all the working group companies that are involved with calling in to discuss SYCL once or twice a week at least. All right, so one thing I've learned from decades of experience in working with parallel programming and in high performance computing, and there has to be longevity in those that's chosen, the programming model that is. And there can be a 20-year lifetime across a range of supercomputers that need to have a common and standard way to write software, hardware changes frequently. So looking at this diagram, that shows how the US national labs, funded mostly by the Department of Energy, have quite a range of different processor architectures. What they're recognizing is that they need a programming model that can support their latest supercomputer, but it has also to be an open standard to be able to influence, to ensure that it brings the best of developers across the labs. Now, these machines, of course, cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And so this is why we want to make sure that we want to see SYCL survive. And in fact, OpenMP, which is why I last worked, had a specification that has lasted to over 20, I think it's almost 25 years now. And it basically envisions the same for SYCL, because it gives you the right elements for everyone to develop highly parallel portable software. So here you see that there's HPC, why SYCL is being pulled into HPC, which is a valid question. So HPC workloads usually are three classes. There are simulations that needs a high performance computing language. There are data science problems that needs high productivity language. And there are machine learning code that needs a high productivity language for ML. Now these have been supported by the top three languages like OpenMP, C, and Fortran, with a mix of CUDA, OpenACC, and OpenCL, but now C++SYCL, Khronos, and Raja. And this is because if you look at the development workflow on the right, what you'll see is that traditionally it starts with choosing the algorithm for a target, then implementing and testing the algorithm. And then you would optimize the algorithm based on the target. Most languages would only allow the optimization, that selection for the target in the last step. But because of SYCL's C++ base with templates and parameterizations, and even basic inlining, it allows you to now choose the target in the very first step. And this has been found to be important for performance. And this is why workloads are increasingly moving to C++. And when they do, they need it to be able to be offloaded to device targets. And ISO C++ doesn't give you that. So they built things like Khronos and Raja. And now they need something that is open standard, because Khronos and Raja are national lab owned languages. They're not really open in that way. So they need something that is open. And so that's why certainly SYCL fits the bill in there. And of course, down the bottom, you'll see that over the time, SYCL has now entered almost every supercomputer across the gamut, from the ones that are being delivered as pre-exascale systems to finally, ultimately, fully exascale systems by 2023.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Have you got a final slide there, and then we'll have to move on in the interest of time, if that's okay.
That's fine. The last slide is just going to talk about the industry engagement. I'm going to leave that on until somebody picks up from there.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Michael. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for the Q&A at the end of the session. Thank you very much for that update.
Thank you.
Straight from the heart of the working group. Hopefully that was very useful for everybody. Thanks, Michael. So I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker. Really excited for hearing this talk. So our keynote speaker is Professor Garth Wells from the University of Cambridge, and I'll leave the rest to you. Over to you.
So thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak today, and I'm really looking forward to the talk this afternoon, particularly as a recent user of SYCL. It'll be very helpful to learn what's going on and what we can expect in the future. But what I'm going to show today is really from a user perspective, and showing you some of our experiences and also some of our results in using SYCL for solving partial differential equations with the finite element method. So much of what I'll show today, the results have been produced by Igor Barata. Igor is a postdoc working with me, and he's on this call, and also with Chris Richardson, who is a research software engineer here in Cambridge. Just to give you a bit of context and of why we're interested in SYCL and the types of problems that we're looking at, I just want to say a little bit about the two projects that are supporting much of the work that I'll show today. So the first one is the Asimov project. And so this is known as a Prosperity Partnership, and it's supported by Rolls-Royce, also by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And it's a partnership that involves 5 universities. And the ambition there is to move towards virtual design and simulation of aero engines. The other project, which I'm very closely involved in and has supported some of the work I'll show, is the Excalibur project. So Excalibur is the UK's exascale computing program, which has been running for about 2 years now. So focus of Excalibur is very much on software and also experimental hardware. And given the audience today, I've just put a small logo there from CodePlay. CodePlay, in fact, one of our partners who are helping us out with some of our Excalibur projects. So before going into some of the motivation and some of the results, I just want to give you a little flavor of some of these applications that we're looking at and are driving, particularly work around exascale computing. So the top left is a model for electric propulsion. And so this is driving considerable research at the moment, how we can move to net zero technologies for flight and for propulsion. And on the top right is a tokamak, which many of you may recognize, because fusion energy is a major driver, particularly behind exascale computing in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world. So I just want to show you very briefly a little video that hopefully highlights the finite element method. So what I'm going to be looking at today is performance results and approaches for the finite element method. So what happens effectively in the finite element method, we have a domain, we might be solving a problem in electromagnetics, fluid flow, thermomechanical response. And we simply iterate over these small cells. For a large scale computation, maybe many billions. And these small matrices that we compute, that's effectively our kernel, they can be as small as 4 by 4, up to perhaps several hundred by several hundred. And what this video illustrates is the assembly of those small matrices into a large sparse matrix. So you can see we've got this small matrix, which then gets scattered with a somewhat irregular pattern to this larger matrix. So I just want to reflect briefly on the history of finite element methods on GPUs. And this goes back to probably the late 2000s. And unfortunately, a lot of the early efforts were not particularly successful. And I say this somewhat provocatively down on the bottom left. The closed codes reported impressive speed ups. Those of us committed to open codes really struggled. And one of the reasons for that is the benchmarks against which things were being compared were sometimes highly contrived. But there's some reasons why we really struggled. So one is the software stacks were not particularly mature. The hardware was not that great. So down the bottom there is a Tesla C1060, which is something I experimented with early on. But one of the main issues is that we perhaps didn't understand mathematically what we had to do to exploit accelerators. So we've more or less mapped what we had done before onto modern hardware. So we're using low order methods, and they're highly limited by memory bandwidth. We're assembling these large sparse matrices, not a very friendly operation on accelerators. And then we were using solvers and preconditioners that just didn't neatly map onto accelerators. In recent years, there's been a real shift, and this comes with us understanding much better what we have to do to make things work on GPUs, but also on CPUs. And so you see a big move towards high order versions of the finite element method. And what that does is it boosts arithmetic intensity, and also a shift away from methods that involve large sparse matrices. And we work now, rather than assembling a matrix, we work with the action of the matrix on a vector. And that removes some memory bandwidth bottlenecks. So what the plot on the right shows is basically the arithmetic intensity as a function of polynomial degree. So on the horizontal axis, polynomial degree, as we increase that, we increase the order of our method. And this is for two representative but relatively simple benchmark problems that are coming out of the US exascale program. And what you can simply see there is as we increase polynomial degree, we increase accuracy, but we really boost the arithmetic intensity. So it's a very strong trend for GPUs in particular, but also CPUs towards higher order methods. So what I'm showing here is some results that we've computed on a CPU. So this is on a dual socket ice lake. On the left, we have a plain MPI code. We're using the full node. And what we're looking at is throughput on the vertical axis. And then we're looking at problem size on the horizontal. And degree corresponds to the order of the method. And you can see there for degree 1, we get the best results, and the throughput decreases for higher order. Whereas if I look on the right, where we've now gone to matrix free, we can see a substantial boost in throughput, particularly for the higher degree methods for the higher orders. So that result on the right is using a combination of MPI and SYCL. So it's on a single node. We can then take those algorithms directly to a CPU, to a GPU rather. So this is on an NVIDIA A100. And you see on the left, the results are really quite poor. But then with some simple refactoring of our algorithm to better match the hardware, we get some very, very nice performance. And again, particularly for the higher degree, the low degree, which is where much of the effort was going 10 or 15 years ago, performance is very, very poor, very hard actually to beat the CPU. But at higher order, we do very, very well. So just to help put that into context, I've shown these two plots already, but what I'm doing here is putting the CPU on the left and the GPU on the right. And you can see here certain performance characteristics, but if we look at the peak flops of these two devices, the difference that we're seeing is about what we would expect. So that's for these benchmark problems where we solve a relatively simple but complete problem. Then to understand better the performance characteristics, what we've been doing is diving down into some of the core operations. So that process involves computing action of the matrix and then applying what's called the conjugate gradient method, which involves a sequence of relatively simple linear algebra operations. So what I'm showing here is simply the AX plus Y operation, very standard linear algebra operation on a Cascade Lake node, so it's dual socket. And we can see there basically the bandwidth that we're getting. The horizontal dotted line is the stream benchmark. And you can see there some various implementations, OpenMP, OneMKL, using just the STL, which is their standard, hipSYCL and IntelSYCL. And once we have a large array size, the results are all very similar. But what we see is for smaller array sizes, there's actually quite a large difference in performance. And if I very quickly go back one slide, and if you look at around 10 to the 6, 10 to the 6, particularly on the CPU, is where we're seeing a peak in performance. So it is an array size that we're potentially interested in, but the different implementations give very different results at that array size. If we now take that code and move it onto a GPU, we're looking here at a couple of different implementations, plain CUDA, Magma, which is a library some of you may know, which supports multiple backends, QBLUS, and our SYCL implementation. If I exclude for a moment QBLUS, we see there for this AX plus Y operation, the results are very similar across the different implementations on this A100. If we look now at a dot product, so this is where it's very nice to have reductions. We also see here that the results are very similar across a range of implementations. And for us, this is very, very encouraging that we can actually use SYCL. We've used IntelSYCL. In this case, I'm showing results for using hipSYCL, but it's very encouraging for us that we can really match performance without having to use CUDA. So it's exactly what we were hoping for. So I just want to make a few points in summary. And the first is that we're very pleased that we have this single source open specification. I've been, over many years, very reluctant to commit effort to a proprietary standard. And we're seeing performance, which particularly on the GPU is very, very satisfactory. The addition of atomics and reductions is very important for scientific applications. It allows us to greatly simplify our codes. And in many cases, we see performance improvements. If I focus on GPUs for a moment, I've shown you, and we've looked in more detail in other cases, but we're seeing performance that we're very pleased with NVIDIA GPUs, and we've compared to a range of, for example, optimized CUDA implementations. We're testing at the moment on Intel GPUs, and the results there are looking quite promising. And we're very much looking forward to the opportunity once we have access to the hardware to test on AMD GPUs. I think for us, some of the operations that would be very helpful for us to have are somewhat lacking on CPUs, particularly in this strong scaling limit as we reduce, for example, the array sizes that we're working on. And something which, the last point, which is really just an observation and to be expected when you're looking at a relatively new specification, is of course the library ecosystem is still maturing. And as it matures, it really does help productivity when there are more and more tools that we can take off the shelf. And so again, that's just an observation and something which no doubt will evolve over time. So that's all I have to say, Tom, but thanks again very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Garth. That was really interesting to hear your presentation. I hope everybody listening found that interesting too. I had a quick question for you, and it was really about how important is this ability to write a single program and run it across such a diverse range of different architectures from different vendors. How important is that for you in your work?
So in our work, that's very important because we don't have the capacity, and even if we did, I don't believe it would be a good use of our resource to be supporting many backends, because you have to learn not only you have to understand the details of your algorithm, how your algorithm interacts with the language, and how all that interacts with the hardware. And I think that a space that you have to explore it simply becomes too great. That there may be groups, maybe teams that feel they can justify that effort to support multiple backends. But I believe most would benefit from a single specification if it's portable in terms of its performance.
Great, thanks, Garth. There's a question coming from the audience, if that's okay. This is from Pradeep. They ask, what SYCL implementation are you using to run on NVIDIA GPUs? And how are you looking at comparing the performance to some proprietary language supported on those GPUs, such as CUDA, for instance?
Yes, so the examples I showed today were with hipSYCL. I mean, Igor might be able to respond more comprehensively. He's actually on the panel today. He has previously tested with Intel SYCL, but he's favored hipSYCL recently simply because it's easier to install. And so we have compared to some CUDA implementations for basic operations that others have implemented, and we've also implemented a number ourselves. And in most cases, the performance is the same.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you very much, Garth. That was a really great presentation. Thanks for your time today. So we're now on to our next speaker. So I'm pleased to introduce Peter Zuzek. Peter is from CodePlay, and CodePlay is going to be the first of our next 5 talks. Each of them is from someone that is implementing SYCL, working on implementing the SYCL standard. So CodePlay is implementing ComputeCPP, which I'm sure Peter will tell you all about in their talk just now. Over to you, Peter.
Hey, thank you, Tom. Yeah, so hello, my name is Peter Zuzek. I'm the product owner for ComputeCPP, which is CodePlay's implementation of the SYCL specification. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about our SYCL 2020 status and how we get to there using address space inference. So yeah, the first thing I want to talk about is that ComputeCPP 2.8 is now available. We have some nice features, so I would encourage you to go and try it out. But yeah, what I want to talk about first is address space inference. So, like, what are address spaces? I think that a lot of you already know about this, but quickly, address spaces mark pointers in disjoint memory. So this is not part of standard C++. Like, for example, in OpenCL, you might have like these global, local, private, constant modifiers. But it's not in C++ itself. But we still encode it in SYCL, in the SYCL spec. Why do we do that? It's mostly because a lot of hardware can benefit from address spaces when it comes to power efficiency. So basically, you have different regions of memory, and you need to tell the device on how you access that memory. So from a C++ point of view, you just have standard pointers, but those pointers are not valid you cannot reference any point of memory anywhere, like everywhere. You need to separate them somehow, and you do that with address spaces. But how do you determine address spaces if they're not part of the standard C++? You can specify some of them as template arguments, like on multi-pointers and accessors as SYCL types. In general, we want user code to avoid writing them specifically, but there aren't actually that many places where you have an address space specified. Like when you write a kernel, you usually just you only use raw pointers and you don't know exactly where they point to. But the compiler needs to know, and the target device needs to know this. So there are generally two approaches that you can do. You can use a generic address space for all your pointers that are not explicit, or you can have your compiler determine all the address spaces. So if you use the generic address space, that's basically saying that anything that's not annotated, doesn't have an address space specifically, you just say that it's generic. What you do need to do then is you need to add additional instructions to resolve this pointer. So this is quite a good approach. For example, this is quite useful in OpenCL 2.0, where it simplifies writing kernels. There are some drawbacks to this. You have some runtime overheads, and your target device must support this. So this is not available in OpenCL 1.2, which is what a lot of the embedded and automotive devices require. So for those devices, you need to have well-defined address spaces. What you can do instead is that what we currently do in Compute++, which is our device compiler in ComputeCPP, is that you can infer all the address spaces using C++ deduction rules. So you treat your address spaces as a language extension, as a type qualifier. You have some initial values that I mentioned before, some extra conditions, and you then use type deduction to define those pointers, to define the address space for those pointers. As I mentioned, this helps developers target a wide range of more power-efficient hardware, so compared to the generic address space approach. But it also has some drawbacks, at least in this implementation. The way it's done is it requires modifications to Clang, which can get quite messy with trying to keep up with newer versions. And most notably, it interferes with the C++ semantic analysis. So there are some inconsistencies that you see. What we've been developing in ComputeCPP is a new approach to inferring address spaces. Is that instead of using C++ deduction rules, we run an extra LVM pass. So you use similar rules as before for the initial conditions. You know which pointers have specific address spaces. But then when you determine an address space for a type, you then propagate it back to all types that use that specific type. So this is basically called type unification. So if you assign one pointer to another, or a part of a pointer to another, or something like that, you know that all that needs to be in the same address space. So you propagate it to all uses of that. So we call this solving the address space for a type. And if you solve different address spaces for the same type, then you can detect mismatches. So the user has done something wrong. And as I mentioned, the big benefit of this is that it does not interfere with the C++ type system. So in general, like detecting all the address spaces unlocks more optimization opportunities compared to generics. But this approach that we have, even though it's very useful and it's important for some of the SYCL 2020 features that we've implemented, it does feature some breaking changes compared to our current compiler. But that also makes it more aligned with other SYCL implementations. So I mentioned we've been working on this new address space inference system, and we've packaged this up into a experimental device compiler and into an experimental package of ComputeCPP. So you can see the link here. You can try it out. And the benefit of this compiler is that in addition to all the nice new SYCL 2020 features that is going to enable, it's also going to follow LLVM upstream more closely. At the moment, it's based on LLVM 13, whereas the previous or the stable compiler that we ship in regular packages is still LLVM 8. So this experimental compiler will eventually become our default compiler. And in ComputeCPP 2.8, the compiler that we ship is almost fully functional, has some exceptions, and we would like you to try it out, but keep in mind that it's still experimental, so there might be some issues. But it is the feature for ComputeCPP. So if I then switch to the status of our implementation, we have a nice feature support matrix on our website. It basically lists the different SYCL 2020 features and which version implemented it. So then you can get early access to individual features without having to wait for the full thing. Some features are exclusive to the experimental compiler, as mentioned, most notably the unified shared memory and unnamed kernel lambdas. You can see it in this example here that we're using both of these features. So for USM, it worked even before, but it required the USM wrapper class. And this is something that really requires address space inference, because you just say that a USM pointer is in the global address space, and then everything works from there. And for unnamed kernel lambdas, you need a special built-in, and it's best if you use our device compiler for the host compilation part as well, so using the SYCL driver switch. We've implemented a lot of other SYCL 2020 features. I've listed some here. Here's an example of reductions in use using multiple reducers. Some features are host only for now. So that means that the interface is there, but the actual functionality will not work on a like an OpenCL device. I want to tell you a little bit more about some ComputeCPP extensions that we have. Most notably profiling. We support JSON profiling, which is basically you get a JSON file that you can, for example, load in the Chrome tracing tab. And we also can support the triSYCL profiler, which is an open source profiler. And you can see some of the output that it generates. We support different performance counters for Intel GPUs and for ARM GPUs. It's possible to tune it using the configuration file. And we have a SYCL extension that allows you to specify profiling zones just to make the profiling experience a bit nicer. There's a lot of other extensions that we have implemented in ComputeCPP. I've listed some of them here. But yeah, some of the more interesting ones might be like the on-chip memory, which allows you to have you have a separate kind of memory that's still in the global address space, but it's not part of the main memory. ComputeCPP also has a lot of other extra capabilities. For example, we have like you can specify your own built-ins that you can use in kernels. You can perform offline compilation. You can have multiple device targets in a single binary. The host device is an interesting one because SYCL 2020 doesn't guarantee a host device, but we continue to provide one. The configuration file allows you to tune the implementation quite a bit. And there's also, of course, this ComputeCPP info tool, which tells you a little bit about the devices that are available in your system. So yeah, I would encourage you to try out ComputeCPP version 2.8 out now. You can use the brand new compiler using this experimental link, and remember to give us your feedback. We would really appreciate that. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Peter. That's a really interesting talk and a really nice update about how ComputeCPP is going. I had a quick question, and I wondered if you could speak to perhaps a timeline. How long do you think it will be before you'll have implemented everything in SYCL 2020? Are you able to share some information about that?
It depends a lot. So we're following the CTS closely. So the CTS is not done yet. So I guess we'll be trying to implement those features as they come. We don't properly follow it. We're lagging a little bit behind, but I guess the sooner the better, right? I'm not able to commit to a specific timeline, but it's in our interest to implement it as soon as possible.
Yep, that's great. Thanks, Peter. We have a question from the audience, and it says, how might your SYCL compiler handle hardware-specific optimizations, such as compiling SYCL by MLIR, for instance?
So it depends. There might need to be some support in our device compiler, or we might be able to use some features if it's already implemented in upstream LVM, especially with the new experimental compiler. That's going to be much easier because we can just rely on that. So if it's more customer specific, there's a lot of options that are available to them, like custom built-ins and all that. Usually, if it's a customer, we work with them to try to improve performance as much as possible.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Peter. Hopefully that answers that audience question there. Thank you very much, Peter. That was a really interesting talk. Thanks for sharing the update from ComputeCPP today. So we now go on to our next presentation. This is from Hiroyuki Takiwaza from Tohoku University in Japan. This is one of another implementation of SYCL, this time called neoSYCL.
Hello everybody, I am Hiroyuki Takizawa from Tohoku University. Today, I'm going to talk about giving an overview of the neoSYCL project and recent updates. The neoSYCL project has started in 2020. The goal of this project is to provide the SYCL programming interface for the users of neoSYCL or Tsubasa. So, what is SYCL or Tsubasa? In terms of the physical hardware configuration, it's a heterogeneous computing system equipped with two kinds of processors. One is vector host, which is a standard x86 processor, and the other is a vector processor implemented as a PCI Express card named Vector Engine. The Linux operating system is running on the vector host. So, if we compile a program with a standard compiler such as GCC, then the program is executed on the vector host as usual. On the other hand, if the same program is compiled with a special compiler for vector engine, NCC, then the program is automatically executed on the vector engine. Of course, some code tuning is almost mandatory to exploit the potential of vector engine. But if you just use it without considering the performance, all you need is to compile the program with a special compiler. Unlike other accelerators, a standard a standard user does not need to care about the heterogeneous hardware configuration to use the vector engine. However, both of vector host and vector engine are, in a sense, general processors to some extent. Unlike accelerators, both of the two processors can fully support standard programming languages such as C, C++, and Fortran. One important point is that they have totally different performance characteristics. Generally, the vector host x86 processor can achieve average performance on any workload. On the other hand, vector engine is designed for scientific computing, especially for memory-intensive vectorizable programs called vector-friendly workloads. If a kernel loop is not vectorizable, then the performance of vector engine could be much lower than that of x86 processor. So we should assign the right processor to the right task to achieve reasonable performance with SX Aurora Tsubasa. NEC provides a native offload framework named Vector Engine Offloading. By using this, an x86 program can load a shared object compiled for Vector Engine and call the function in the shared object from the x86 program. Vector Engine Offloading provides all the necessary features for offload programming, but the programming interface is non-standard and dedicated only to SX Aurora Tsubasa. That is, we need a standard programming interface to develop applications in a portable way. Motivated by this, we have started the neoSYCL project. neoSYCL is a C++ wrapper class library to implement the SYCL interface on top of vector engine offloading. It relies on the kernel outlining approach. A kernel part of a SYCL program, represented as a functor, is translated into a loop in a distinct function. By doing this, vector engine offloading can call the kernel function from an x86 program. As a result, we can offload the kernel execution to vector engine while programming with the SYCL interface and internally using vector engine offloading. We have already tested the performance of neoSYCL using some simple benchmark programs. If an entire program is executed only on vector engine, most of the execution time is spent for non-kernel portions that are not vector-friendly. But if only the vector-friendly kernel is executed on vector engine and the others are executed on vector host, then we can significantly reduce the total execution time. Since neoSYCL is just a lightweight interface layer, the performance is almost the same as that of native offload framework, vector engine offloading. Another important point is that SYCL code is less complex in terms of some code complexity metrics. So neoSYCL can achieve high performance and high productivity at the same time. This slide shows our recent updates. These days, we are doing code refactoring for improving the conformance. We know that the OpenCL execution model does not fit in SX Aurora Tsubasa. So even if we support these features, it would be difficult for SX Aurora Tsubasa to achieve high performance using the OpenCL-like model. So at present, we do not support these features. Except for the unsupported features, neoSYCL can pass all of the basic test cases. And we are also developing a benchmark suite named VEO SYCL Bench for two reasons. One reason is that we found that both of neoSYCL and data parallel C++ do not work with SYCL Bench by default. I'm not sure if there is a workaround, but because of the second reason, we have decided not to use SYCL Bench in our project. The second reason is that we need to compare the performance of neoSYCL with that of vector engine offloading because we want to discuss the runtime overhead due to the high-level abstraction of the SYCL interface. That is, we want to discuss so-called abstraction penalty. To this end, only the kernel part of each benchmark is copied from SYCL bench to our benchmark suite, and the rest is rewritten to make the benchmark simpler and more portable. Using these benchmarks, we are evaluating the performance of neoSYCL more extensively. This slide shows the evaluation results. The blue bar indicates the execution time of each benchmark with vector engine offloading. On the other hand, the orange bar indicates the execution time with neoSYCL. They are almost the same for every benchmark. neoSYCL is only 0.42% slower than vector engine offloading on average. So we can say that the overhead induced by neoSYCL is negligible. Moreover, the complexity of SYCL code is lower than the complexity of the vector engine offloading code. So the SYCL interface is not only portable, but also productive, less complex at offload programming for SX or Tsubasa. In summary, neoSYCL is a simple implementation of only header files to provide the SYCL interface on top of vector engine offloading. It uses the kernel outlining approach. Our evaluation results demonstrate that SYCL is promising to achieve high performance and high productivity, as well as code portability due to the standard programming interface. neoSYCL is still under active development. To be honest, there are multiple code versions, and also it has some performance problems. So we are now working on code refactoring and solving the problems. At present, kernel outlining is a simple code transformation. I believe that improving the code transformation will be interesting from an academic point of view. And also, more advanced code transformations must be effective to exploit the system performance. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, it was really great to hear about neoSYCL. So thanks very much for that presentation. We're now coming up to the break. So we've got a short 5-minute break. So I will stop talking and see you in about 5 minutes, resuming at the times shown on the screen. See you in 5 minutes. Thanks, everybody. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you were able to step away from your computers, your screens in that short 5-minute break. Welcome back to the triSYCL webinar. And we'll begin with the next set of talks. We have 3 more talks, all from implementers of SYCL, followed by our Ask the Experts Q&A for the final 25 minutes of the session. So with that, I'd like to hand over and introduce James Brodman. James is from Intel and is going to be talking to us about DPC++. Over to you, James.
It would help if I unmuted. Thanks, Tom. My name is James Broadman. I'm going to be talking about the DPC++ implementation for SYCL. So what is DPC++? It's a project that's adding SYCL to the Clang compiler, and it comes in two different flavors today. The first is an open source project that lives on GitHub, and the second version are the Intel OneAPI product compilers that can be obtained as part of the OneAPI toolkits. The DPC++ compiler is developed as a downstream fork of Clang and LLVM, but we're actively working on upstreaming it to the main trunk of Clang and LLVM to add SYCL to all LLVM and Clang-based projects going forward. Recently, Alexei Bader from Intel was appointed the official SYCL code owner in Clang. So that's an effort that has been going on for just over 2 years and continues today. DPC++ targets several different platforms, depending on which version of the compiler you're using today. If you're using the Intel product versions, that supports Intel CPUs, FPGAs, and GPUs via OpenCL backends today. It also supports Intel GPUs through the OneAPI level 0 runtime. But really, it's set up such that it can target any device that supports OpenCL 2 with the right extensions, namely support for SPIR-V and Unified Shared Memory. If you're using the open source version of DPC++, that adds support for NVIDIA GPUs through the CUDA runtime and AMD GPUs through the ROCm runtime. So one thing I'd like to say about DPC++ is that it really is being developed in the community. Development happens first on GitHub, and everything is developed in open source. So whenever new features get added, they first appear as pull requests in the GitHub version of the compiler, and they'll appear in future versions of the product compiler, which is itself based on the open source project. And it's not being driven only by Intel. We've had contributions from very many different people in the community, and I'll just go through a few now. For example, CodePlay has been a very active contributor and added a lot of support for the NVIDIA backend. The AMD support came out of nowhere this year as just a random pull request on GitHub, which was pretty cool to see. And throughout the life of the project, we've had support and code reviews and contributions from many community members, including Ronan Cariel, who will speak later in this webinar. Additionally, there have been other projects that have built on the DPC++ compiler since it is an open source project and it's available for anyone to use and extend. Examples of this include there's a version of triSYCL that uses DPC++, and recently Huawei provided information about their implementation of SYCL built on top of DPC++ that targets their Ascend AI processor. So DPC++ is working towards full SYCL 2020 conformance. We're not there today, but we hope to reach there sometime next year. Throughout the course of 2021, we've made many improvements and added several new features, including support for ahead-of-time compilation, so you can go all the way to your device's native instruction format and avoid JIT time when you're running kernels. We added support for SYCL 2020 aspects and device has queries. We've improved several features throughout the year, including backend interoperability with the CUDA, OpenCL, and Level 0 backends. We've also improved the support for reductions and subgroup algorithms. And support has been added for the kernel bundle APIs that appeared in SYCL 2020, as well as the new math array types and specialization constants. We've also added a new extension to SYCL 2020 that provides support for static local memory declarations, which slightly simplifies that interface, and various other device-specific extensions as well. DPC++ continues to evolve as time goes on. We've generally defined language extensions to serve two different purposes. The first is to enhance performance of your applications running on different devices. And the second reason we do extensions is to just enhance overall programmer productivity. Several DPC++ extensions did become core features in SYCL 2020. Examples of those include unified shared memory and reductions. And we're continuing to develop new features that we hope will appear in future versions of SYCL. And this could include things like support for device-side global variables and other features. So where can you find DPC++? It's available to use and try in many different places. It's available in several popular package managers in Linux or other open source development frameworks. It's available for use in the Intel Dev Cloud. And if you'd like to just get the compilers directly, you can find the open source project on GitHub, or you can find the OneAPI toolkits on the Intel website. So we hope everyone gives DPC++ a try, and if you're interested in contributing, feel free to head to GitHub and send us a pull request. Thank you.
Thanks, James. That was a really great presentation, updating everybody about the DPC++ project. As a starter question, I thought in your presentation you gave a really clear direction for defining what DPC++ is. So how does that fit into the OneAPI package in general that Intel has talked about before, and how does all this relate to SYCL?
Sure, that's a great question. So the OneAPI project from Intel is a overall effort at developing an entire ecosystem for heterogeneous programming, which includes not only languages and programming models like SYCL, but also libraries and tools that are built on top of those. So you can have advanced math libraries, machine learning libraries that have SYCL interfaces that can work on not just GPUs, but CPUs and FPGAs and other types of devices as well. DPC++ is, I would say, one of the main direct programming models that's part of OneAPI. And DPC++ is just our implementation of SYCL. So SYCL is really a core feature of everything OneAPI is built around. Several of the different OneAPI libraries all have SYCL-based interfaces. OneMKL is built on top of SYCL. OneDNN is going to have SYCL interfaces. So SYCL is a very, very key feature. It's not the only feature because there are many different programming models in the world. So, the Intel products do aim to support things like OpenMP as well, because we have lots of existing customers who use that programming model. One of the other things to note about OneAPI is that some people tend to think that it's only just an Intel thing. And there are really kind of two aspects to OneAPI. There are the Intel products, but the Intel products are just implementations of what we call the OneAPI specification, which is an overall industry initiative defining these library interfaces that anyone is free to go implement and use. And we've had several members of the community start adding implementations of those OneAPI library interfaces on top of different vendors' optimized libraries. So for example, you can use the OneMKL BLAS interfaces and the DPC++ compiler to target NVIDIA GPUs and get high performance code that lowers down to cuBLAS at the end of the day. And so that's a very attractive thing for developers.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks for that. Hopefully that's given everybody a really nice overview of how this all fits together with all these names that we've all heard about over the last few years. We've had a question from the audience, from Wei Chen. They ask, are there any plans to include the CUDA and ROCm backends in some package distribution of the DPC++ compiler? So do we just get those backends from GitHub, or can we download them built from a package manager or something?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we're trying to figure out what the best path forward is there. We have a couple different ideas. We haven't decided exactly what we're going to do yet. And don't hold me to this, but one possibility could be we could provide binary builds of the different plugins that you can then drop into an existing OneAPI product compiler. Yeah, there's several different options we're looking at, and we hope to have something decided on fairly soon.
Okay, thanks, James. And if someone had an idea of how they think they would like this to happen, what's the best way they can contribute to DPC++ to help this happen?
Yeah, probably the easiest way is to go to GitHub, and it's you can leave us an issue there, add a comment, or if you're very adventurous, provide a pull request with a new feature or anything of that sort.
That's great, and that's the GitHub that you're showing on the slide right now. Yeah.
Correct. Yes.
That's great. You had a slide that showed about what progress you'd made with implementing the features in SYCL 2020. Is that available as a resource on the website too, or is that just collated for this slide?
Yeah, I collated that for this slide from the release notes throughout the year, but similar to CodePlay, we also have a web page that tracks our implementation of SYCL 2020 features. I can get that link added to the appropriate resource as part of this webinar.
That would be brilliant. I think that would be really helpful for people wanting to write SYCL 2020 codes and then be able to see what implementations support all the features. Yeah, if you have that link, that'd be great to share it with everybody today.
Sure, no problem. Thanks.
Thanks, James. So with that, thank you very much, James, for your presentation and all the questions. It's been really great to hear all about DPC++. So we'll move on to our next speaker now. Our next speaker is Ronan Kerel from Xilinx. And Ronan has been involved with SYCL for a very long time and is the spec editor. So any typos, we need to let Ronan know. So Ronan, over to you to tell us all about triSYCL.
Thank you for the introduction. So I will talk a little bit more about the triSYCL project we are working on at Xilinx to target our devices, which are FPGAs and CGRAs like our FVers or API. So if you want to program with SYCL, an FPGA, you just write a normal SYCL program. Of course, you need to use probably a special device selector for the queues, but at the end, you will just run some normal code and it will just run this program for you. And what is a little bit magical for FPGA is that actually generate an electronic circuits that implement your kernels, and at the end it is implemented done right to the hardware. For example, here our answer 42 is just this blue, the last light blue kernel here, and the rest is some housekeeping because it's in that case, it's an old FPGA card, so you do not have a hardened PCI controllers or hardened memory controllers, so you have to implement this also here. But what is cool is that you can then program some weird stuff on FPGA, so why not graphic stuff? And that it starts like a joke inside the Khronos committee, but it was interesting for us to experiment with some programs outside of the usual FPGA comfort zone. So it was useful to experiment with different programming styles, and also to fix a lot of bugs inside all of our tools, from runtime to compilers and everything. Well, to be fair, this application is very inefficient currently on FPGA, because we just use a CPU implementation, but that gives us some good insight about, oh, maybe we could have some FPGA efficient implementation of graphic stuff if we spend some time to adapt the architecture. But more seriously, to give you an idea of the feedback it gives us, is that in this typical algorithm, you are using a lot of all dynamic polymorphism that you have in language like Java or whatever, or even C++. The problem is that behind the scene, it uses function pointers, which are not usually handled by accelerators, and it's actually not in the SYCL standard. Oops, sorry. What our HLS tools, high-level synthesis, VITIS tool can do is just to remove some trivial devirtualization when you have only one class in use. But in some serious applications, that means that you cannot really run this kind of code on FPGA. But the great news in C++17 is that you have stud variants that allows you to replace actually all the virtual dynamic polymorphisms that you have in this code by using stud variant, where by using these new types, you will be able to rewrite your algorithm by explicitly dispatch with a stud visit, so it's standard C++, the right functions, for example, hit to compute the interaction between array and an object, and to dispatch it directly to the right object without using a dynamic polymorphism. And what is cool with FPGA is that while on the CPU or GPUs, you will have a lot of if to just dispatch your stud variant if you're not using function pointers. But in our case, FPGA is implemented in hardware with spatial computers, which means that you can actually compute all the ifs hidden in stud visit in parallel. And that means that theoretically you can dispatch it in O1, which is very cool stuff. And at the end, we can generate this ray tracer, or this path tracer, sorry, in the yellow here on our FPGA. So it's cool. But more interesting is since SYCL is pure C++, that means that you can provide some refinement levels with just C++ abstraction. So you can start with normal C++. With SYCL, you can add some heterogeneous parallel computing with memory address spaces and things like that. But we can go on, and that's what we're trying to do with our triSYCL experiments. For example, on FPGA, you have a lot of different memories on the system. And so it's obviously important that you can specify where you want to place your data, because otherwise it will hinder the power efficiency or the performance. For example, here we're using accessor properties to just specify on each DDR bank on the card you want to place your data when you run this kernel. But more interesting that you can do whatever you want with arithmetic, for example, since FPGAs are very adaptable, so you can recycle some new standards which are coming into the modern C23, which is this specific integer type. For example, with bit int3, you can define 3-bit data, and then when you compute on this, you can really compute on 3-bit data if the hardware can do it. And the cool stuff is that FPGA, you can really do it. So it's wrapped into C++ API int templated types. And then you can, for example, implement some weird floating point data types to fit your application. For example, here 7-bit exponent and 14-bit mantissa. So there are some way to do that. But at the end, the most interesting part is that you just write some normal SYCL code, which use some normal buffer of this new IEEE types that you have defined here, and voila, it just run with your new floating point data type on your system. And another problem is that when programming on FPGA is that you have to handle a lot of various configuration files and things like that, and it doesn't fit well in the single source world. So we've experimented with using the user-defined literals to directly embed some compiler optimization, some VITIS optimization directly as a kernel decorator with this underscore VITIS option, that it will compile this kernel with this option, which means that now you can even meta-program the compiler, the VITIS compiler optimization from SYCL. If you are not using an Xilinx FPGA, it will just compile fine and it will just be in your. So it really leverages the power of the underlying tools too. So another stuff we have super cool at Xilinx is our new device, which are coarse-grained configurable arrays. So aside the FPGAs, you have this 400 array of tiles organized in a tile array, and each tile is actually VLIW SIMD processors, and with each one has its own memory, and you can interact with your neighbors and access to the neighbor memories and so on. So it's very interesting, and we are experimenting with leveraging some SYCL concept to program this, and we have added the concept of memory and tiles to just express that directly into SYCL. So you have some very direct translation into buffer and devices. For example, we expose our device as a kind of a SYCL type. Then, for example, we can have one buffer per tile, and we have some new helper function to iteration on all our X and our tile coordinate, and then we can execute, for example, here, the initialization of our buffers on the host side, and then we will send on the subdevice tile XY, we will submit some work, which is a single task. And then again on the host, we will wait for all the tiles to finish and just to get the result with another host accessor. So then you just now have 400 devices that you can interact with. Of course, it can be a little bit cumbersome if you're doing, for example, some partial differential equation and things like that. But for such a code, we have also a mode which is more collaborative. That means that you can directly access your own memory and do some computation on it, which is M here, and you can also interact with your neighbors to implement a distributed tensile operation. Behind the scene, well, since it's pure C++, that means that, of course, if you have a real implementation, you can run on real hardware and hardware simulator. But since it's pure C++, you can run also on the host CPU, which means that you can use all run your tools, to just debug your application directly on your laptop, for example, and you can actually detect some hardware feature bugs with your thread sanitizer, just because you have a direct translation from the hardware feature down to C++, and that means that you can really experiment with future devices and things like that. From the implementation side, as James said, we are recycling the Intel OneAPI DPC++ to directly target our OpenCL OS API for our runtime to control our FPGAs. For the CGRA, we have a completely different runtime. And we merge this with some the historical triSYCL implementation, which means that we recycle some special LLVM passes to message the IR. And the main difficulties is actually to do some completely unsupported Xilinx VT stuff with some modern environment, because there is a mismatch between the LLVM IR supported by the latest, provided by the latest Clang LLVM, and what is actually handled by VT. So that makes things very complex. And we have a V++ driver, which is a Python script to orchestrate everything. So to conclude, all this is ongoing research project. So if you are really wanting to do some real stuff, just use the normal Xilinx tools. But what is cool is that SYCL is a standard, and it's pure modern C++, which means that since it's single source, and that means that you can express everything in a single language, and you can meta-program the full architectures across all your devices, and it provides the target emulation, all the debug, the co-design on your laptop for free. And since there are some open source implementation of these open standards, that means that you can really target the real things, which modern systems have often several accelerators from various vendors, and it's pretty cool to be able to program everything at the same time and without being locked in. And it's even more interesting for us since AMD announced that they want to acquire Xilinx, and then there will be in the same company, like at Intel, CPU, GPUs, FPGAs, and CGRAs, and so voila.
Well, thank you very much, Renan. Lots of really interesting things happening with SYCL and at Xilinx. So thank you very much for sharing all of that. Very much enjoyed your spelling of recycle with SYCL in the name. Hope everybody spotted that. I had a question for you. If someone was writing SYCL to target an FPGA, how would you recommend they get started, and what sort of best advice would you give? What sort of first order advice would you give someone trying that?
You need to first to have some good ideas whether it will be efficient or not, because it's kind of a different way to think. So you really need to first assess that you can have enough spatial parallelism and pipelining in your application, so it will be efficient on your application, and then you can pick a SYCL implementation targeting FPGAs and just try. Actually, even if you do not have a real FPGA, you can just experiment with a simulation mode and see if you will get or not good result before diving too much.
Fantastic. Okay. Thanks, Renan. Thank you very much for your talk. That's really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be lots more questions to come in the Q&A session coming up. Thanks, Renan. So on to our next talk. This is the last talk for today before we go over to the Ask the Experts session. So I'd like to welcome Axel Alpay from Heidelberg University. Axel is the lead on the hipSYCL implementation. So really pleased to have Axel here today to talk about hipSYCL. Over to you.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to give a brief update on hipSYCL, what we're up to, and how hipSYCL roughly works. So hipSYCL is a multi-backend SYCL implementation that currently has 4 major backends. It has mature support for CUDA and ROCm for NVIDIA and AMD GPUs, and also for any CPU using OpenMP. And there's also some experimental support for Intel GPUs using level 0, although this is still very experimental and some parts are not yet implemented for level 0. What it effectively does is it aggregates multiple tool chains and provides a common interface for all those tool chains. For example, OpenMP, Clang's CUDA toolchain, Clang's hip toolchain, Clang's SYCL toolchain, and so on. And you can use those all with a single toolchain and program them using a single SYCL interface. We track the implemented features using a dedicated web page that you can find at github.com/hipsycl/feature support. And this image here shows an excerpt of this page, which is quite outdated by now because these 3 items that here were not yet implemented by now are all implemented. And we support all of the, or most of the key SYCL 2020 features, such as unified jet memory, reductions, subgroups, group algorithms, optional lambda naming, and so on and so forth. hipSYCL is open source, so you can just get it at the GitHub repository. And it's also a SYCL implementation that's already in use by larger projects. For example, recently the Khronos project announced that they are using hipSYCL to target AMD GPUs for their official AMD support. hipSYCL also tries to experiment with future directions for SYCL and to improve productivity and performance by providing extensions. For example, one extension that we have is interoperability between SYCL buffers and SYCL 2020 USM pointers. So you can always take a SYCL buffer and get the pointers out, or you can always take a USM pointer and construct a buffer on top of it. And I also quite strongly believe that an implementation is only half the thing that you need to get done. You also need to have libraries. And so we're also trying to support SYCL libraries, for example, OneMKL. And recently we have announced that upstream OneMKL now has hipSYCL support. So we can use, for example, the plus domain of OneMKL with hipSYCL. And as I had mentioned, it already supports most of SYCL 2020. One of the key features of hipSYCL is the interoperability with CUDA and hip at source level, which means that, for example, if you have a kernel and you call some optimized kernel function, then you can insert this optimized kernel function with some macro magic, detect if you're currently targeting a CUDA device, and if so, you can put in native CUDA code or native hip code or native OpenMP code if you're on host, for example, to create optimized code paths. This allows you, for example, to use vendor-optimized template libraries such as CUP or AMD's ROCprim and call that from your SYCL kernel. Or it also allows you to do incremental porting of CUDA or hip applications to SYCL. So you could basically just start porting it. You don't have to port all your kernels at once. You can just port the high-level kernel interface and still call your good old CUDA kernels for the time being, so that you can incrementally port your applications to SYCL without blocking the overall project progress for a long time. hipSYCL also supports a multi-backend runtime architecture where a core runtime library loads individual backend plugins for the actual backends. And it also distributes the work that is coming in from the user-provided SYCL queues across the backend queue pools. And that means that you get the same amount of overlap of data transfers and compute, for example, no matter how many SYCL queues you use. And this allows it to maximize the extracted parallelism. For example, it can happen that if you take a straightforward CUDA application that just uses like a regular CUDA stream, port that to SYCL and use it with hipSYCL, performance goes up because hipSYCL can automatically execute operations concurrently, even if you're only using a single SYCL queue. hipSYCL supports multiple compilation flows. The most simple compilation flow is the pure library, pure OpenMP C++ compilation flow, where you're just targeting CPU, and you basically pipe your input SYCL code, can use it with any OpenMP compiler, which then produces an output binary for the CPU. And this is expressed using SYCL-CC, which is our compilation driver, and then just providing OpenMP as target. And then you can optionally specify your OpenMP compiler. The second mode, the more elaborate mode, is the Clang-based flow, where you take your SYCL code, and then hipSYCL uses potentially multiple Clang tool chains to create code for multiple targets. So, for example, there could be a host pass, which creates which targets the host, and again optionally with OpenMP acceleration. Or it can also create add a CUDA compilation pass, which would then produce PTX, or a hip compilation pass, which produces AMD GCN for AMD GPUs, and so on. And in these modes, it adds a Clang plugin to the Clang compilation, which then tells the Clang CUDA toolchain and the Clang hip toolchain how to understand SYCL constructs. And if you want to use this, then you basically just specify the backends that you want to target using this syntax. And very recently, we have started adding support for a new compilation flow, which is the NVC++ based compilation flow. In this mode, hipSYCL acts as a simple library for NVIDIA's NVC++ compiler. And that means that it invokes NVC++ to generate code for both host and NVIDIA GPUs. And then, this is work in progress, there might be some restrictions. And then you would optionally be able to additionally add Clang compilation passes for other backends, such as AMD, which would then again be put into the output binary. And this mode is activated if you pass CUDA and VCCXX as hipSYCL target. So hipSYCL, as I had mentioned, supports multiple toolchains. So we have very mature support for hip and CUDA, as well as OpenMP. SPIR-V and level 0 for Intel GPUs is still experimental. And as I'd mentioned, we're working on NVC++ support, which one of the main advantages of this is that it might simplify deployment even further, because on an HPC cluster using NVIDIA GPUs, NVC++ might already be pre-installed, and then you wouldn't have to have LLVM available. You could just point hipSYCL to NVC++ and be done with it, basically. Another thing that I'm very excited about is that we're working on adding compiler-based acceleration for SYCL constructs. So there are certain kernel execution models in SYCL that are difficult to map directly to OpenMP, in particular ND range parallel 4. And for this, we are adding compiler-based compiler support for this, which can help us, for example, with vectorization in certain cases. And that means that you would get high performance kernels and can execute those on any CPU, even if there's, for example, no OpenCL implementation available for this CPU. You can also use vendor-supported compilers with hipSYCL, and this has the advantage that you get day one hardware support, and you leverage the hardware expertise of the vendor, and you can also get the performance that's on par with vendor programming models, because you're using the same code generation algorithms in the compiler. And this already happens with regular upstream hipSYCL with the hip backend, where you can just build hipSYCL against the Clang that ships with ROCm, or you can use vendor-provided OpenMP compilers. We have this experimental support for Intel hardware, which you can put on top of DPC++. And once we have the NVC++ support merged, this will also be possible for CUDA. We have also several interesting extensions in hipSYCL. For example, as I'd mentioned, the interoperability between buffers and USM pointers. We also have scope parallelism, which provides a novel kernel programming model. That's kind of an attempt to pioneer how a future version of hierarchical parallelism could look like in a future version of SYCL. We have asynchronous buffers, which are buffers that don't block in the destructor, which can solve certain performance issues. And hipSYCL can also have kernels that operate concurrently on the same buffer, which is not possible with as strictly defined by the SYCL specification. And we have many more extensions, and you can find a list of all of those in the documentation. Another interesting experimental extension that we have is multi-device queues and system queues, which is a queue that's not bound to a single device, but instead can dispatch automatically the work to multiple devices or to the entire system. And the API for this is already there in hipSYCL. It's just not particularly efficient as of yet. So we're working on tuning this, but eventually we're hoping that this should work well. And another thing that I'm excited about is we're working on integrated task graph profiling. And basically the idea here is that hipSYCL will be able to tell you how much the execution time of a kernel correlates with the overall application runtime by taking into account the actual dependency graph of the execution of the executing operations. hipSYCL is particularly easy to deploy because you can usually just point it to existing installations of LLVM, NVC++, ROCm, and so on, and you don't generally need to compile large software stacks such as LLVM yourselves. And hipSYCL itself usually compiles in a matter of seconds if you have a fairly recent build machine, or maybe minutes if you have a very old build machine. But it doesn't take hours in any case. We also provide pre-built binaries and software repositories for common distributions, and there are also third-party spec packages that you can use. And yeah, so if this interests you, then you can check it out on the GitHub repository, or if you have any questions, drop me an email. Thanks.
Thanks, Axel. That was a really great, comprehensive update about hipSYCL, where it is now and where it's going to be going in the near future. So thank you for that. Hopefully that was very interesting for everybody. I found that really great to hear. So thank you, Axel. We've had a question come in from one of the attendees. Mika asks, is hipSYCL supported on Windows, or is it just Linux?
Great question. So we have Windows in our CI, and we support the CPU backend on Windows and also the CUDA backend also, although you might have to use a specific patched version of Clang to get that to work. And there's documentation in the hipSYCL wiki how to do this. AMD GPUs, unfortunately, we cannot support on Windows because AMD does not support ROCm on Windows.
Okay, great. So lots of things worked, and the documentation's on the wiki page. So check that out. That's the wiki at your GitHub that you have on the slide, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Fantastic. Another question from an attendee called Douglas. Does the multi-device and system queue support different backends?
Yes.
That's great. So I can target everything all at once with hipSYCL. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, basically that's the idea.
Cool. That's great. Okay. I think we are out of time for this. Obviously, you're going to be sticking around for the next session. So thanks once again, Axel. That was a really interesting talk. I hope everybody found that interesting. So with that, we're going to move into the final session of this webinar, and it is an Ask the Experts session. So it's a Q&A. These Q&A sessions thrive with audience interaction, so please keep those questions coming in. I've got a number of questions that have come in already, and a few more questions that I will direct to everybody that you've already asked. So if there's a question that you wished you'd asked one of the speakers earlier, please drop it in the Q&A and I will put it to them. I've also got some questions that you've asked that I'm going to ask all of our speakers today to comment on. So with that, we'll begin the Ask the Experts, and that'll run for the next 25 minutes or so until just past the top of the hour. We'll go until about 10 past. We'll aim to end the webinar, so 10 past the hour. So the next 25 minutes or so we'll go with this Q&A. So I'd like to invite all the speakers to turn their webcams on. I will do the same so you can all see us. There we are. Hello, everybody. Nice to see some faces. So I will start with some questions that came in a little bit earlier today. And I think it's interesting, given we've heard from Michael, from the working group, from Garth as a user of SYCL, and this is perhaps a question that is relevant, something Garth might ask. With all these different implementations or flavors of SYCL, and perhaps some of them are currently adhering to the SYCL standard in different ways today, how can a user, someone writing a very complicated application such as the finite element method, as you showed, Garth, how can us users be assured that I can write some universal code? And so how do I know if I enter a SYCL ecosystem that I won't be locked into a vendor, or that my code will be portable between all the vendors? Let's put that to someone. Let's start with Michael.
Yeah, you read my mind. That's a great question. It didn't used to be a problem when there were only a few implementations, but damn, this is what happens success brings. But it's a good thing. There is a kind of a mechanism that Khronos has, and it's called a conformance test. And unlike other standards, you can get yourself to become conformant. And I think that's one way. That's definitely one way. Now, the idea is that hopefully more compilers will now choose to go the conformance route. And with this conformance means that you also have to pass a bunch of conformance tests, and it means that you can claim certain amount of conformance. And that means that you have a core set of features that will allow you to be portable across. That's probably one way, but it's a fairly heavy-handed way. And I'm hoping that the other implementers will offer some other ways that will say, maybe a compiler flag that says, this is SYCL 2020. This was a problem with C++ as well too. Compilers would generally have to offer some kind of flag to say whether you're C++ 11 or 17 compatible. So with that statement out, I think I basically said the part that I want to say, representing SYCL as a whole, and hopefully other people will chime in.
Axel, what do you think?
I think that having multiple implementations is not a problem, it's the solution. If you only have one implementation, then you actually risk being locked into whatever this particular implementation does. But now that we have so many different implementations, you can actually just try and see if your code actually is portable and works across all of those. So it gets better.
Excellent point. And if I'm going to jump, I'd like to jump in one more time. Sorry for monopoly. I have so many of these ideas because I think, to Axel's point about more implementations, this is what happened when people started putting compilers on Compiler Explorer. They could check multiple implementations from different vendors and see how well that piece of code generate code. And that actually resulted in much tighter conformance. So we're not on Compiler Explorer yet, but I'm hoping that we will be soon. And with all these different implementations on there, that will allow you to check that kind of conformance even better and faster. Thank you for reminding me of that. That's all.
James, what would you like to say?
Yeah, so both Axel and Michael have, very good points. Multiple implementations gives users, choice, and it keeps all the implementers kind of honest. And, we have some co-opetition to, race towards the end goal of full conformance. But additionally, many features in SYCL 2020 are optional, depending on your backend or type of device. And there are mechanisms in the language that let you query whether a given feature is supported for particular device that you're targeting. So there are programmatic ways that you can check whether or not the feature you're trying to use is actually supported. And we're looking at new things we can put in future versions of SYCL that can do this in a compile friendly way, because you don't want to necessarily be in a situation where you're trying to use syntax that just isn't implemented, and you don't want it to cause a compile error if you're not actually trying to use it. And in the past, things like if defs and preprocessor hacks were ways to try to kind of guard around these types of things. But modern C++ is adding new capabilities in the form of things like const expr if. So there may be future directions we can go to kind of bring devices into that kind of compile time constant evaluation to determine what features are available to use in different kernels.
Okay, that's great. I think it's also worth just reminding everybody that SYCL is an open standard. So if you write a program that follows that standard programming model that is SYCL, those implementations will gain conformance to that standard too. So that helps with this guarantee that you've written that if you write a standard SYCL program, that it will run on multiple implementations that support that SYCL for that particular version of SYCL itself. Okay, the next question that I've seen come in is perhaps one that follows on from one I asked Axel earlier, and it says, is there any SYCL implementation for AMD GPUs on Windows? Maybe you're in a good position to answer that.
As far as I'm aware, no, because you need, so if you're building a SYCL implementation, you need some sort of lower level that you're tying into. And generally, this is the GPU compute platform of the hardware vendor. And for AMD, this is ROCm, and ROCm does not run on Windows. And it doesn't matter if you try to go through hip as a language, or if you try to go through OpenMP, which also builds on AMD's OpenMP compiler, also builds on ROCm. So you would also hit the same limitation. It might be possible with some very old OpenCL drivers, but I'm not too sure. Maybe Peter can say something about the Spear or Spear V situation.
I think that's the main problem. We've had a lot of problems before that, like old drivers used to work, but then AMD kind of dropped support for Spear, and I'm not sure about the status of their Spear V support. So that's kind of a problem for us.
I hope I will have a better understanding soon.
Okay, that was a great question. We had a question earlier from Amanda, and I'd like to start it by directing it at James, but then I'm going to broaden the scope to the other panelists. Amanda's asking that they would like to know more about the differences, perhaps pros and cons, between the OpenCL backend and the OneAPI level 0 backend. What does DPC++ use by default, perhaps, or does it all go through to OpenCL in the end? So James, perhaps you could start.
Sure. Level 0, I'd say, is very similar to OpenCL in that, they're largely designed to solve the same problem. It's a lower level compute runtime. I'd say level 0, it was designed to be kind of slightly lower level than OpenCL. So it's designed in more of a kind of modern Vulkan view. So it's not as immediately user-friendly, I'd say, as OpenCL is. It's also newer, and we've been working on it for a couple of years now, and we're continuing to evolve it and add features. Today DPC++ can target both. Level 0 is the default for Intel GPUs, although OpenCL does still work there as well. Our current implementation is not layered on top of OpenCL as far as I know.
Okay, thanks, James. So I think in general, something that SYCL 2020 provided is the ability for implementers to support a variety of backends. So I'd like to sort of open this up generally, and we'll go through all the implementers about. Do you want to talk a little bit about what backends that you support, and maybe some details about how you go about supporting those? So let's start with Peter for CoPlay.
Which backends we support? So in general, it's OpenCL is the main what we target, and even like the experimental PTX support that we have, that still goes through the OpenCL interface. The same we would do for others, like we focus on OpenCL, but there are plans to extend that to support other APIs as well. There's nothing concrete yet in terms of what I could say, but there's definitely interest in getting there, especially for all the safety critical stuff. That's where OpenCL would not be sufficient.
Okay, Axel, I know you talked a little bit about this in your presentation.
Yeah, I've covered this. So we have a HIP backend for AMD GPUs, CUDA backend, OpenMP backend, level 0 backend. We have made some experiments with a TBB backend, which may or may not be merged in the future for more task-style programming. Yeah, these are the backends we have.
And Ronan, what about triSYCL? You said about FPGAs?
So, yeah, we are focusing Xilinx targets mainly. So for FPGAs, we used to work with a Spear, a backend, and OpenCL. So we are still going on with OpenCL for the host API to control our XRT runtime. But we moved recently to a pure LLVM IR backend because it's more supported by the VITIS tools, and it provides you more functionalities. And for the CGRA, we also rely on pure LLVM IR, and we have a completely ad hoc backend for the host side. But what is important here is that it's relatively easy to add a new backend for whatever processor you have. It's just writing some host runtime, and if you have LLVM support for some processors, it should be easy to adapt.
Okay, great. I think that's all the implementers. So when you joined the webinar, we asked you a question.
There is still Intel to talk about.
I think James started first, didn't he? Yeah, there's a poll question that we asked you all when you all joined. So I'd like to share the results of that poll, and then we're going to discuss some of those with the panelists. So the first question that we asked you all was, are you currently developing code with SYCL? And hopefully you can all see the results, but for those that can't, it was about 36% said yes, 26% no, and 38% definitely in the future. So what do our panelists think about that? So about a third of people have already used SYCL, and just over a third would like to try it in the future. Michael, what do you think?
I think this is fantastic. This is actually saying, so we have almost, at the beginning of the meeting, there was almost 80 people here. And this is almost saying 40 to 50 people are already using or will plan to use SYCL definitely, with maybe about 40 or 30 remaining who says they haven't. We're now down to about 50 because, you know, as the thing goes on, some people drop off. But yeah, that's really good. Thank you.
Ronan, what do you think?
Well, obviously, if people are here, that's because they have heard about SYCL. But yeah, that's interesting to see how SYCL is making progress, and with this, increasing number of implementations, and also there are a few high quality implementations now. So it's really a very interesting standard. So I'm not surprised that there are more and more people wanting to try it.
Thanks, Ronan. I think looking at the second question now, it's a summary of what features of SYCL 2020 are currently being used. So to summarize, it looks like just over half of the responses say they're using USM, around 30% for reductions, 25% for group algorithms, another 30% for the simplified accessor constructors, things like the CTAD, and then 16% atomic ref and 21% backend interop. James, I wondered if you had any thoughts of this. Does this mirror what you see the most demand for in your implementation, things like USM, reductions, and the group algorithms?
Yeah, I think so. The USM was definitely one of the top kind of requested features we were hearing from our customers and users. Reductions have also been very important, particularly to HPC customers. Group algorithms are particularly useful, I think, for people who are trying to migrate code from other GPU programming models into SYCL, as well as backend interop, which helps with incremental porting, where you don't necessarily want to translate all of your code at once, and you want to call some kernels written in SYCL and some kernels written in other models.
Great. And what about you, Peter? Does this mirror the view that you see of your customers using SYCL?
Yeah, definitely. Like USM is definitely not surprising. I wasn't expecting group algorithms to be that high, but I guess it makes sense. It's all of this has been designed to get more performance and simplify programming. So
great. Yeah, I think this is really interesting feedback for the implementers to see. And what about you, Garth? When you were working with SYCL in your application, what were any of these features of SYCL 2020 important to help that process?
I think it's been touched upon already with scientific applications. I think it's probably reductions that allowed us to make the greatest simplifications.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that. Okay, we've got lots of questions come in from the attendees, which is brilliant. Do keep them coming in. So the next question is related to this combining different backends in the same program. So a couple of people have asked this. So I know that Axel, you talked about combining different backends in a multi-device, in a system that has multiple devices. What about the other SYCL implementations? Lots of them support multiple backends, and can you combine them all together? So let's start with the order of the talk. So we'll go to CodePlay first, Peter.
sorry, I must admit I wasn't quite listening there. Which question are we looking into?
The question is, can I use, how can I target multiple devices, or perhaps multiple devices with different backends or from different vendors in ComputeCPP?
Yes, so in general, you have different options for the backend. So SYCL 2020 is backend independent, and if you use features like the host task, you have like an interop handle, and then you have to specify the backend that you use for each interop object that you retrieve. So it's possible, from the SYCL perspective, you have multiple devices, and they have a backend associated with it, and you can use all of them. And then if you need something specific, you can then specify, I know this device is an OpenCL device, so I'm going to use the OpenCL backend specific stuff. And this other device is, for example, a CUDA device, so I'm going to use that.
That's great. What about you, James, from Intel?
I have many thoughts on this topic. So there are two ways I think you can kind of view this type of meta queue approach. One is as a way to try to kind of automatically load balance across all the different devices. where it can dispatch different submissions to different devices. Another is a way to try to partition one submission across multiple devices. And I think both of those are very challenging research problems that don't have clear answers today. And this type of feature, I think, can be useful to some users, but you have to be very disciplined in how you structure your kernels and in how you use the pieces of the programming model, because it can be very, very easy to write legal programs that can now behave unexpectedly because of kind of implicit assumptions that are no longer guaranteed. Like you may introduce coherency issues in your kernels now that didn't exist when you targeted only a single device. And these are really kind of challenging programming model and system level research questions that need to be solved before these features, I think, can be kind of generally enabled in every implementation.
Thanks, James. Any further comments from anyone on that?
Well, I think that SYCL is pure C++, so you can re-implement whatever you want yourself. And more interesting is that you could even combine different SYCL implementation in the same application if one does not fit your demand on some device. For example, hipSYCL can export itself with a special namespace like triSYCL too. So at some point, if you really have some special needs, you can do whatever you want yourself because it's just modern C++.
Okay, that's great. Thanks everybody for that. That's definitely an interesting topic. We've got a few questions that are looking beyond SYCL 2020 and asking for some features, and it'd be good to discuss what we think of those. So the first one from Shoken asks, is there any support for distributed memory parallelism? So where you have multiple nodes communicating over a network, you might use MPI for that now. Is there any support for or any future for distributed memory parallelism in SYCL?
I can take that one. I would expect over this next year, as several of the US exascale machines start coming online, that we'll start seeing SYCL-enabled implementations of MPI. I think initially these will probably focus on accelerating the performance of the host MPI portions to avoid kind of unnecessary extra copies between device buffers and host buffers, things like that, being able to directly DMA from, the GPU to your NIC and things of that sort. GPU directed distributed communication is, I think, a little farther out in the SYCL world. I know people are working on this both in the MPI kind of one-sided communication space, and a lot of the heterogeneous programming models are looking at SHMEM-based programming models. There's both NV-SHMEM and ROC-SHMEM, which is again this kind of one-sided distributed communication mechanism, which is probably a reasonable thing to do, particularly with a model like SYCL, because they're fairly orthogonal and don't really get in each other's way. So they're probably a nice thing to try to stitch together. And I would expect to see more developments on that front going forward, but I think it's early days.
Thanks,
There is
James.
also the Celerity European project targeting MPI nodes based on SYCL. So it's a kind of virtualized SYCL on top of MPI, on top of SYCL.
That's right. I was going to mention that exactly. Celerity is kind of going ahead with that, with OpenCL and SYCL built on top of MPI. And it's already kind of heading in that direction. So for that, I think we definitely want to talk to people like Peter Thoman from the University of Innsbruck, Biagio Cosenza from the University of Salerno. They're both working group members, and they're doing this on the Marconi 100 supercomputer. And they are already exercising this capability because you're absolutely right. People are looking for this kind of things, and they need it And so this is where Celerity comes in. It's an open source project that focuses on providing a way of scaling applications to a cluster of accelerators without having to be an expert in distributed memory programming. Okay, so hopefully you guys can reach out. We can put a link to that if you're looking for. They're on GitHub, and there's actually, if you just search for SYCL Celerity, you'll probably be able to find a lot of links about that.
Thanks, everybody. That was a great question. Peter, there's a question that I'd like to put to you from Marcel. In your talk, you talked about profiling tools for SYCL, and Marcel is asking about profiling support in the standard SYCL itself. So at the moment, we can only profile execution time, but what do you think? Would it be better to have some sort of extra profiling information that you could pull out of the SYCL runtime to help with the profilers that you've been working on?
Interesting question. I guess it might be difficult to put that into a standard that all implementations could implement, because, like, as I mentioned, we have profiling support, but it's very specific to what we do and like the calls that we do. So I guess that would be then like exposing some of that in a standard way that everyone would be able to use. So I guess there would be value in that. I guess the other implementers would need to say, like, how do they see profiling? Because I believe Intel has some profiling as well, the XPTI stuff.
So I can lend a little bit of experience in this. Many programming models tend to have these kinds of side channel things that they need to support, like debugging, profiling, and they might need a standard hook. So I can look to OpenMP's model where they actually have a side group that does OpenMP profiling data and debugging data. And that's actually something we could also do as well. So yes, you're right, Peter. It's not necessarily part of the main standard, but it could be a kind of a addendum to the standard. I can't remember the name of the professor from Rice University. It's just at the tip of my tongue. Some of you guys can help me with it. But he did the work with the OpenMP.
John Miller-Crummy.
John Miller-Crummy, thank you. He led the work with HPC Toolkit that is dealing with the static data providing for debug. So it's just a hook, and then other people can now just connect to those hooks and those call channels. Okay. And eventually, I think we're going to need that. Thank you. Thank you. How can I forget John's name?
Any more comments on that?
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges there is some of the types of profiling information that was called out in the question really depends on that information being available in whatever backend your SYCL implementation is using. So it would be very useful if kind of all the different device programming backends did support this similar type of information, because then it's easier for a SYCL implementation to kind of aggregate it all up at the SYCL level, rather than trying to interpret different counters in different ways depending on whether you're targeting an AMD GPU or an NVIDIA GPU.
And that's exactly what the OpenMP profiling does to it. They gather all the information in standard tables, and now the vendors can access them easily.
Okay, I think we'll finish with one final question that came in a little bit earlier. And the question, I think, is an interesting one, and I'd like to ask all of you in turn what you think. The question is, what might the advantages or disadvantages be from a performance, portability, and productivity or development point of view for SYCL over other programming models? And they suggested OpenCL and OpenMP. So I'll start with Garth. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I'll be able to articulate this very well, Tom, but when we're looking at algorithms, OpenMP feels very much like a retrofit rather than thinking in terms of parallelism from the ground up. And no doubt everything can be done with these different models, but it feels somewhat awkward rather than being able to operate in one consistent framework.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think that's an important point of view for you. If you're coming from the algorithm's point of view, you want something to express the parallelism in your algorithm in it. It's a matter of choice in some ways. Michael, what do you think?
Oh, I was hoping somebody else would take the heat off of me on this one. This is one of those kind of questions that are ripe for flames. But I have to say I have looked at these very, very closely, and I love. And you know, so the thing is, see, so OpenCL, some would say lower level, and you know how I always think of everything in terms of the triangle of productivity, performance, and portability. So I like to think that, you know, C++ based languages like SYCL and Cocos and Raja tends to be higher productivity. So it tends to be closer to the two corners of performance and productivity. Okay. And as you get to more OpenCL, it tends to be more cornering down into the very performance side, but you know, it's more specific, right? So it's more specific. And OpenMP, and of course, everyone knows I love OpenMPs, have always and still do, but you know, OpenMP using this pragma-based language, as God says, tends to feel a little awkward when you want to do a kind of the higher abstraction type of things that C++ is good at. It's really good for loop-based parallel loops that where it came from. So C's Fortran, absolutely go to town on it with OpenMP. Okay, so they all have their different strengths in the triangle of performance, portability, and productivity, in my view. Thank you. That's a diplomatic answer, as you can see.
Ronan, why don't you go next?
Next, in which meaning?
What do you think about SYCL and performance, portability, and productivity?
Yeah, of course. Coming from an FPGA company, it's you know, you make some simple change in some C++ code, and you have a factor of 1 million in performance. So, I mean, at least SYCL, I mean, performance portability does not really exist, except if you work in some very narrow area of DSL. But SYCL is direct programming language, but at least it allows you to program in a single program all the accelerators you want in a unified way. And of course, it's like in probably any other language, you will have some differences if you write the code in some direction or in another one, but at least you can do it. You can optimize your code for unique supported architectures, and that's the important side.
That's great. Thanks, Rana. James, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the real strengths of SYCL is that it is based on modern C++, which makes it much easier and more convenient to be able to specialize your generic portable code into device-tuned versions, while at the same time kind of maximizing your code reuse between your generic version and your device-specific version. So the modern C++ underpinnings, I think, are a real strength for SYCL there.
Thanks, James. Peter, at CoPlay, you use SYCL in all sorts of different domains. How important is this performance, portability, and productivity with SYCL for you?
I would say it's a huge benefit. Like compared to OpenCL, it's like the single source programming model that's very important because it allows you a lot of like optimizations you can do, then also like kernel fusion, all that stuff. I think there's also been like a lot of research projects that showed like how SYCL can you can achieve the same performance with fewer lines of codes, like we saw in the neoSYCL presentation, for example. So I don't know. Yeah, I agree with like whatever was said so far, and I think that's a big part of like the performance portability is also what I believe you've also been involved with Tom, with Simon McIntosh Smith. There was the paper that showed how how SYCL performance portability fares across, well, compared to other programming models, and also how you need to look at performance portability in terms of like not just, you're not going to get excellent performance by default. You're still going to have to tune your application for the specific device, but at least SYCL gets you very close to it gets you good performance by default, not optimal, but good performance.
James, were you going to add something there?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, you know, depending on the code, SYCL can give great performance out of the box, writing fairly generic SYCL. You know, I don't want to say that all codes will require a large amount of tuning.
Yes.
Thanks. And finally, Axel, what do you think about this question of performance, portability, and productivity with SYCL?
So what I really like about SYCL is that it kind of removes some burden from you at the right places while still giving you the tools to optimize at other places. For example, on the host side, generally, if you write an application, you don't want to spend a huge amount of time to say, okay, now copy this data to device, now copy back, now do this, now invoke this kernel. You just want to say, okay, I want to use data and I want to write my kernel. And then you want to continue optimizing the kernel. And SYCL allows you to express this in a very convenient way. You can just use your accessors or your shared use M allocations or whatever, and you don't need to worry about all these things. You don't need to worry about device initialization, data copies if you don't want to. Inside your kernels, though, you have the option to worry about all the details that matter for performance. You can use special SIMD types. You can use local memory explicitly for performance optimizations and so on. And you have access to all those tools, and I think this is what makes it so valuable. You can pop up the hood and you can start tweaking if you want, but you don't have to at all the places where you really don't want to in general.
Thanks, Axel. And I think with that, we're running out of time. So I will take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers. Thank you all for your time today. All your presentations were fantastic and very interesting, and great to hear all about how you're using SYCL and about the future of SYCL and how your implementations of SYCL are going forward. Thanks also for your candid answers in this Q&A. We really appreciate that. So thank you all for your time today. I would just like to finish off today just with by sharing this quick slide. So thank you to everybody who attended today. Thank you for your great questions. It's made a really interesting discussion for the last half an hour. So it's great to be able to interact with you all and answer your questions about SYCL. We're going to make a recording of this presentation and the whole seminar, the whole webinar available at the Khronos website. You'll see the link on this slide, and we'll share that with you too. All the slides and everything will be made available, as well as the recording. Please keep in touch. There's lots of ways that you can get in touch with Khronos and talk to us about SYCL. There's lots of links on the slide there. You can find out directly from Khronos at the working group URL, and there's lots of other resources available linked through all those different pages. So please do stay in touch and get connected with all the SYCL news, especially as you can hear, there's lots of things happening in the future with all the implementations. Finally, as you leave this webinar, you will be given a link to a survey. We very much appreciate it if you could fill that in to let us all know what you think about this webinar. So with that, I will finish. Thanks once again to Khronos for hosting us, and there's been great support from the team there for helping us organize this webinar today. So thank you to Khronos. Thank you again to all our speakers. We couldn't do this without you. Thanks everybody for attending. I hope you found this afternoon very interesting. I know I certainly have. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, Tom. Wonderful job. And thank you, everyone.